Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give it a 15, 20 seconds here to let everybody in, and then we'll start our webinar. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Alex Martin, partner over at KW Property Management Consulting. We have a special webinar today. We have David and David. Remember, like Dan and Dan from the Olympics? David and David. So we got David Haber. He's the managing and founding partner at Haber Law, and we have David Schaub, which is the principal of Sharp Project Development. David Schaub, can you give us a little bit of your background, how you started a company and how it's going today?
Sure, absolutely. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for attending. Our company was founded in 1990 by my partner, Orlando Sharp, and we're a professional project management firm, owners, reps. We get called different things, but it's interchangeable. And we've been doing this type of thing for close to 35 years. Before that, I was a contractor with a large firm here in South Florida. I'm a general contractor, civil engineer. Most of folks on our staff are licensed or degreed in some form or fashion. We're a staff of 18. And we've been in the business of just managing projects from day one. And the condo market is a big part of what we're doing these days. There's been a floodgate of projects, even prior to the Surfside disaster. There's always been a need for restoration, and it's morphed into something more, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. Thank you for being here. Mr. David Haber, a little bit about you.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome, everybody. My name is David Haber, managing partner of Haber Law. We're a 40-lawyer firm. Our offices are in Wynwood, in Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach. We have board-certified lawyers in construction as well as in condominium and HOA law. I happen to be board-certified in condominium and HOA law, and looking forward to assisting you all, answering some questions, and providing some good information about how to deal with construction projects and certifications and SERVs and all of the wonderful things that the legislature has passed.
Well, we made it, right? It's 2025. I mean, 2024 was a tough one. I think we've gotten through the storm.
Trust me when I tell you, I've spoken to some of the state legislators. There's more coming.
I know.
There's revisions, there's modifications, and hopefully there will be some loan programs. Just off the bat, Miami-Dade County has a loan program, $50,000 per unit owner that you can apply for a loan. So I don't know how much money they have set aside for it, but if you all have projects and you need loans as individual unit owners for projects, please make sure you check the Dade County website for the program that allows for a loan of up to $50,000 interest-free.
That is amazing. That could help a lot of people.
Well, I think that's what the state's going to have to do. Going forward, they're going to have to come up with some loan program where they either back the loans, reduce the interest rate, something. It's either going to have to be state or federal. I don't think the county is going to be able to do this on their own.
But David, you haven't seen legislative wise where they're looking to back off some of these requirements. These are set in stone.
I spoke to Representative Lopez, who told me that the Speaker of the House, who is from Miami-Dade County, is taking the position that people having waived reserves for 20 and 30 years, they have very little, I don't want to say patience, but very little sympathy for people who chose not to act in a fiduciary capacity, and people who really kick the can down the road. They're not feeling much. They're not feeling much sensitivity to that. Their position is, you did this to yourselves, and we're not going to bail you out. Now, whether the legislature sticks with that approach, or whether or not the legislature ultimately lets up on the neck of unit owners, has yet to be seen, and will have a lot to do with the pressure that they're under from their constituencies.
Mm-hmm. Which $50,000 is a significant amount. Some buildings are actually north of that, which is a problem. The longer these take, these projects morph, and if the client or the building owner and the board is not comfortable with understanding where the cost of these projects are, they can get stuck. And so, hence the reason why you want to have someone like a firm like ours come in and help you start with your initial assessments of costs of the work, cost of all your soft costs and what it's going to take to pull this off, and the applicable contingencies. But having someone safeguard you, assembling a proper team is paramount early on in the process, David, which, as you well know.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that from the get-go. A lot of I've litigated a lot of cases where condo associations have entered into multi-million dollar contracts that are 2 pages, front and back, or they just sign a proposal from a contractor. They have no specifications from an architect or engineer. They've not had a lawyer review the contract to determine warranties, amounts of insurance, time for performance, how to deal with hurricanes, how to deal with scheduling, how to deal with parking, how to deal with storage of materials. There are so many things that go into a GC contract. So one of the things that we as lawyers look to do is partner with the board, the management company, and owner's rep company, if an owner's rep is appropriate, and then work with the design professionals, whether it's an architect or an engineer who's done the specifications and sealed the drawings, to vet, let the management company, the engineer and or an owner's rep vet, or all of the above, vet potential contractors, find out which ones have been in lawsuits, which most of them have, but which ones they've lost, and what is their capacity to do the work with their workforce rather than subbing out the work to a third party who doesn't have the quality that you want to do a
Excellent
stucco
point.
or a concrete restoration project or a railing project, um, or a parking deck project, a pool project. So really it's a team. You have to assemble a team. You're talking about spending millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. Do not take the shortcuts of not having your lawyer, not having a proper engineer, not having a proper owner's rep if necessary. You must assemble a good team. And you have to, the lawyer has to negotiate the contract with the engineers. The lawyer has to negotiate the contract with the owner's rep. Then the engineer and and the owner's rep and the engineer are going to assist the lawyer in negotiating the terms, bidding out the contract, making sure that everybody's bidding apples to apples. And then they have to work with management, because management are the people dealing with the owners on a day-to-day basis. And
Absolutely.
you have to figure out with your manager, when are you going to close the pool? How long is the front entrance going to be closed? Where are people going to park? All of this thing, the manager cannot manage a building and run a construction project. It's just, I have found in my experience, it is virtually impossible. Something has to give, and they either can't manage properly or they can't run the project properly.
And we've seen failure, but I say not word failures, but we've seen projects not succeed for that reason. And we've been called in when projects they decide they're going to start that way and it didn't quite work, and now we're playing catch up, trying to help them solve problems with an agreement that was ill prepared, exhibits not in place, improper exhibits in place, and you're faced with trying to backpedal, and it becomes a real challenge. But you're absolutely right. Many of the projects we work with the property manager hand in hand, the board, to make sure that timing is of the essence and that these things are in place. And too many times we got to manage expectations, because what you talked about is trying to get the board to agree to the contractor, then go through the contract agreement, get everybody aligned, and making sure that all the ducks are in a row. These things take time, and if these aren't managed in a master timeline, you can end up in trouble. And
But
many of the projects we do on the West Coast, there's a finite time. Everybody wants to do work on the West Coast during the 6 months of the year that are available. Here, it's a bit different on the East Coast. So different animals, but the problem remains that you have to have a master development schedule so people know when's the special assessment going to hit, when do I need my loan to close, and when do I start making payments, and will the work coordinate with that?
a lot of the things in the contract are somewhat sophisticated. For example, if you're working on a parking deck pool project and you're changing tile and you're doing waterproofing, you want to make sure that you have a certain type of warranty. You want a 20-year warranty, not a 5 or 10-year warranty. Same with expansion joints, roof. You also want what's called an overburden warranty. Overburden meaning the waterproofing is not as expensive as putting the tile down. And if you have to rip up the tile and put it back, that could be $1.5 million, whereas the materials to do the waterproofing could be $100,000. So you want to get a specialty warranty. You have to use contractors that are approved by the manufacturer. You can't just bring in anybody you want. Let me answer one of the questions that is on here. Robert Owen asked a question: what does state and Broward County law require of HOAs regarding competitive bids for projects over what cost threshold? You need 3 competitive bids unless you cannot find 3 bidders.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And part of that is vetting. Typically, on a normal project, we will meet with council, with the property manager, with the board, and vet through 5, 6, 7 available contractors in this market that are capable of doing that kind of project. And so it's interesting. This segues to, we'll interview 5, probably usually nail it down to 4. We may get, of those 4, get 3 bids in. And like David was saying, they need to be qualified, localized, and self-performing is our preference, because the last thing we want to do is have them depend on a certain subtrade. Certain products they may not be able to because it's a specialty product. Many times some of these contractors want to take it all on, and that may not be the right approach. So we look at that and say, if we have to divide this contract up into multiple primes, sometimes that makes better sense for the project.
Yeah,
And
you may have a situation where you're doing a pool project and a concrete restoration project, and then you're doing a lobby project or you're doing a roof project. You're not going to use the concrete restoration person to do the roof, and you're not going to do the inside of the pool with the roofer, and you're not going to do the expansion joints with the same person who's doing the pool. So
And you know, David, and you mentioned this, and it triggers something, because we talked about this the other day. We happen to do a project in Fort Lauderdale that actually is a tower. There's a seawall, there's a pool, there's interiors. The problem was the client called us and said, "Look, we have some interior work we want to do." And then it morphed into, well, the seawall. Then it morphed into, well, we need to do the milestone reporting. And so what happened was, they really didn't have their arms around the scope that needed to happen. So the power buy and the ability to kind of wrap our arms around something that was more concise type of project scope, and maybe get ourselves a more valid bid, or something that was a little more, had more meat on the bones, it would have provided us a little more competitive edge, let's say. So it's important to be able, for the boards and the folks that are on this webinar, to think about, what do you have ahead of you? What's the timing for each of those? And not to rush one, but phase them properly, where you can do the best for your community, and know that if you can put these together in one package, great. Otherwise, allow the owner's rep to help you figure out the best way to navigate that to be the most economical.
Yeah, and every building is different in terms of scaffolding or hanging off the building. Every building is different in terms of where the pool is, where the parking is, how you're going to close the parking. Are you
Sure.
going to have the pool open in the winter and closed in the summer? How are you
Don't do
going
the
to do these?
roof before your swing stage, because you're going to tear the roof up anyway. You know,
Right.
things that
Yeah,
you need. It's like,
this is why you have to think these things out, and you have to work with the team to figure it out. I want to mention one other thing, and that is on a concrete, and we talked about this in the preparation session. And Alex, you may want to talk about it a little bit as well. There are a lot of concrete and stucco restoration projects right now, and people get shocked that a $6 million project becomes a $16 million project, and they just can't understand how 6 million turns into 16. And just to let the people on here know, it's very easy for a $6 million project to be 16 million 2 years later, because corrosion in concrete and cracking in stucco gets exponentially worse as time goes by. You may have 10 cracks right now. However, within a year or two, those 10 cracks could be 100 cracks, or the rusted rebar inside the concrete that's spalling could get significantly worse and go not just in the balcony, but come all the way into your unit. The problem that most buildings have is that they don't want to spend the money on destructive testing. They don't want to spend a sufficient sum of money to test the concrete in various areas. We typically recommend a statistical sampling of various units in the building so that you can have a better approximation of what the other units are going to look like. You don't know unless you destructively test. Otherwise, you're basically blind saying, I'm going to go raise $6 million. But what you don't understand is contractors for this kind of restoration work do not work on a flat fee. They do not work on a max contract. They work on a very simple basis: quantity. How many square feet, how many linear feet? That's the way they work. And they give you a price per linear foot, a price per square foot. And then it depends on how bad the corrosion is. And they have to go from where the corrosion is, David can talk about this more, but to where there is no corrosion. So they just keep searching and searching and going further, and every foot they go is more money. So if you test 15 or 10 units, even if it costs $250,000, you may be able to then have more trust from ownership. Many of you have heard of some of these buildings that are getting sticker shock and they're angry at their board because they don't understand why the board is assessing them $25 million and they think it could be done cheaper. If you're on the board, you want the protection of saying, I not only got an expert report, we did a statistical sampling. This is what they estimated to be. And that way you get a better estimate and you get more credibility with your owners as compared to coming in at 6 million and then 18 months later you say, oops, people, we need to special assess more, we need a bigger loan, this, that, or the other.
I agree.
Go ahead,
And
Alex.
David, a person told me one time, if you don't do this, it's like not get, what do you do when you go into surgery, right? You go get an x-ray and you go get an MRI so you can anticipate when you go into surgery. And if you don't do this, it's like going in blind and not understanding what's behind the stucco and the concrete. So
Alex, that's a great analogy. You and I have talked about that before. You don't go into surgery blind. In fact,
100%.
I've spoken to surgeons, they have a backup plan to the backup plan, and a fourth plan. You don't want to go and start doing exploratory surgery, in the middle of the project. You want the exploratory part to be in advance of the project during the destructive testing phase, during the quantitative and qualitative analysis through a statistical sampling, so that you can go to the owners and you can say, listen, we're not just asking you for 16 million because we want to. We would have loved for it to be 6 million, but we tested the north, south, east, and west sides. We tested 3 elevations. We spent $220,000, and we're confident that this is going to cost us at least $16 million.
Agreed. David Shop,
right.
Well, a lot of our boards will say we don't need a project management. We don't, and then I see these change orders come in and they cost 10 times more than what a project manager or company. But can you explain a little bit over this? How
yeah, look,
we're doing this for so long. You get it. You're able to anticipate.
It's a small price to pay. The board are volunteers. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the knowledge to be able to kind of go through these change orders, go through the contracts, and be able to assess and advise and push back at the same time. The engineer is a big part of that process, and looking through this and making sure that the quantities are defined. We have established unit prices in place. So the key is really having somebody on your side to be able to advocate for you. And like Dave was saying, it's inconsequential in the scheme of things, the amount of fee that a project manager owner rep's going to charge. At the end of the day, that fee is being saved multiple times over just because of the nature of the work.
And David, can you talk about what kinds of things you as an owner's rep can negotiate? Like, for example, if they're going to tell you, we need $1 million for general conditions because of the way we're going to scaffold. Do you have the ability to push back on that and say, no, you could scaffold differently, or you can stage differently, and you can save as much money? Do you get involved in those details?
We do. And we had a project, the Twin Towers that we're working on now. recently, and the approach was from one of the contractors. We looked at a few different ways, and we recommended that they double up their crews and actually work their way around both buildings concurrently, which reduced the time frame of the overall project. So that's the key of trying to find a contractor that's capable, that has the manpower to maybe come in there and figure out a way to go through that and manage that more effectively. On the contrary, we've seen projects where the general conditions are too low and say, look, these projects require handholding. They require someone to be in there on the contractor side managing this on a daily basis. And so sometimes that low general conditions isn't really the best approach. You want the right general conditions. So we get into and look at and analyze what's in those numbers. Why are they what they are? And do we need, I want to understand how many folks are there at what layer, assistant project manager, somebody on site all day managing this project, because they're managing their own folks, which sometimes could be 20, 30, 50, 200 people on a job, depending on the size of the project.
Let me answer another question that I just answered. Same question as Robert Owen, Recondominiums, saying 3 bids unless there are insufficient contractors to do that work. Like if there's a type of specialty work that only one contractor in town can do. Next question, how important is our building chief engineer in relation to the special assessment projects, even if you have a project manager? David, you want to try that, or
Say that again.
Alex, do you want to try that?
David, how does your company work with the chief engineers on site? How important is that?
So extremely important. So we meet on site with the engineer on a weekly basis, and the communication is usually far greater than that, because things are going to come up that come their way. We want to be part of that process to make sure that if an alternate's being proposed, although it may be cost savings, is it valid? Does it make sense? What kind of warranty does it hold? But the alignment with the engineer is key. There's an acronym. It's called EOC, which is the Engineer Owner Contractor Meeting.
No, they're talking about the building engineer.
Oh, the building
The
engineer.
building engineer, the maintenance manager. Yeah.
Remember something, the building engineer is not a certified engineer licensed by the state of Florida, cannot sign and seal drawings,
That
cannot
person,
oversee the construction. So
that's
how
a building
important is the
liaison,
building
is what
chief
that is.
engineer? The answer, in my opinion, is they know the maintenance of the building, they know the building, they need to interact with the owner's rep and the contractor and the engineer, but they're not going to oversee the construction. David,
No,
do you
where
disagree?
they come into play on some of the projects we've done, when we're talking about cooler tower replacement, elevator modernizations, maybe some interior things that do with the kind of systems in the building, the engineers, a very valuable asset to be able to help not coordinate the work, but be able to program it and make sure we understand the roles and the scope of work that's forthcoming. When it comes to exterior restoration, they're usually just in the way. We're not really working with the engineer. It's more about maybe logistics and making sure that they are in sync with what's happening. And they'll typically attend that weekly meeting because they're in the know. They need to know what's happening because the unit owner is going to pull them aside during the course of the day. So they need to be in the know.
And Liz was asking that question. They'll know where all the valves are, all the shutdowns are, where the pumps are, and work closely with you and liaison with the association so you can do your work.
100%. And listen, we've come on projects where, so we got it. The property managers got it. We got a great engineer. I said, guys, that's why we're here. It's not. They're going to fail at something, and it's likely going to be both. And then you're going to have a bigger problem. So let them do the job that they're set out to do, and let us do our job.
Next question was, how is the formula to determine pooled structural reserves established? You have a reserve study analyst, and they look at how many years that these things need to be fixed, whether it's a 10-year lifespan or a 30-year lifespan, and then they add that up and they divide by 30 in essence, and they do that for all of the different pooled reserves. Alex, you have any different answer on that?
You answered that perfectly.
Okay. Alex, why don't you lead us into another area?
How do you Andrew brought a question here, is how do you calendar these year projects to a maintenance log? So if we David Shop, if we replace a cooling tower is replaced, how do you implement the maintenance log to that new cooling tower that was just installed?
So, well, at that point, it's a do-over. You've got a new cooling tower, so you get it that you've got your starting point, and it's likely got some lifespan to it. So I'm not quite sure I understand that. So it's really you're going to actually start tracking the components of that system day one, because there's a lot of moving parts to that, and you're actually, in theory, your engineer's going to do that, or he's actually going to have a vendor in there who actually did the install that's going to be checking on it. You're likely to have quarterly inspections. And there's monitoring devices we can have put on those as well that monitor vibration and things like that, which you typically wouldn't have an issue with new equipment, but it's worth contemplating that when you get into new equipment. So I'm not sure if that was how the question was posed and if I hit that answer correctly or not.
I would also add that when you get the new cooling tower, you get a manual.
Mhm.
And you make sure that your building engineer understands the manual, number one. And sometimes because you have a warranty or an extended warranty, what you do is you make sure that either the manufacturer or the installer is coming every year to check the roof, to check the cooling tower, and check the water treatment and make sure that everything you're doing is proper so that you don't end up 5 years later needing to fix the cooling tower a second time.
Well,
And
that's where we come in as a management company, the chief
That's
engineer.
correct.
And
yeah,
we
and one
collect
more
all the
thing that
OEM manual specs, put it into our systems, our technology, and make sure that everything gets done on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis to expand the lifespan of that equipment.
Now, one of the things that we've done on some of the larger projects, we do some work at University of Miami and places like that, where projects sometimes are what they call lead certified. There's commissioning agents. So many times we like to even bring a third party, like we would the roof, like a roofer. We bring in a roofing inspector. It's good to have someone looking at the system, making sure it was installed, although the engineers looked at it, and so has the installer, and so has the property manager. Getting that commissioning agent in and make sure everything is done perfectly is just another insurance policy, and it's not that expensive to do.
Perfect. David Haber, there's a question here that says, how can we revise a reserve study if we feel certain structural items are not priced correctly, or the item may have a longer life asset span? I know we get this a lot out there where somebody says, I used to be this position, a board member, and our generator, it says the lifespan is
I used to be a
25.
contractor, or I was, right. So here's my answer to that. If you're on the board, you want to be protected by the business judgment rule, which gives you protection and indemnification and a protection against liability under the state statute, so long as you are not guilty of intentional misconduct, willful misconduct, gross misconduct, and or criminal activity. We know what criminal activity, intentional activity would be. You punch someone in the face at a board meeting.
You've
You
never seen
shoot
that happen, have
somebody.
you?
I've seen police at board meetings, so you never know. I've seen people throw chairs at each other. But in order to be protected by the business judgment rule, you surround yourself with experts. The management company protects you if you take their recommendations. The lawyer protects you if you have a board certified lawyer and you listen to their advice, if you listen to the engineer, if you listen to the owner's rep, and if you listen to the reserve study analyst. Now, do not take it upon yourselves to make the decision to reduce the amount of money from the reserve study. If you want to get another reserve study from a qualified company to do a reserve study, that's a different issue. But I would not go out there and take on the job, the responsibility, and the liability of getting sued later because you decided to cut the reserve study dollars in half because you think you know better. That's how I would answer that question.
Perfect. I'm seeing a lot of, there's a question here from Paulina where lawsuits from owners against the HOA. Do individual board members have a right to consult with the HOA attorney about the lawsuits against them to understand the implication?
The answer to that is yes. If you're being sued as a board member or being threatened to be sued as a board member for the actions you take as a board member, you have a right to indemnification from the association. You have a right to communicate with, consult with the board's attorney. If you get sued, then either the general liability insurance or the D&O insurance, which is directors and officers insurance, should be appointing an attorney to represent the board and or you if you get sued.
Thank you, Dave. David Shop, there's a question that came in here for you. At what size of a project should the board hire a project manager to oversee the project? If they're just doing a pool, should they hire project managers to do the pool, a 30,000 gallon pool? Or, should the PM company be overseeing this? Should a management company overseeing this?
Look, we always recommend that you have a project manager. Obviously, it's not self-serving, and we've worked on projects that are simple, paint of an exterior, which isn't a very significant project, but complicated because of the logistics component of it. You have to swing the building, you've got to maintain, access and egress and all life safety and all those things. So from a pool perspective, we've been called on that too, and we'll go out and talk to folks. It does make sense to have a project manager. It really becomes a point of diminishing return. It's if the pool is only a small project, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it doesn't really exist today, it may or may not make sense. And I can't really see there's a value where it makes sense to call somebody in, but for a simple phone call and have somebody looking at it for you, it does make sense because you do need to get competitive bids, which starts with an RFP, and it comes with leveling and qualifications and then advising and getting them under contract. And all that takes time and energy. Sometimes we could spend a year in pre-construction trying to get a project off the ground because there's so many components of that project. So the board changes as well along the way, and then it's a redo. So having an ownership as a constant a lot of times makes a lot of sense for boards. We see it all the time. I'm faced with it many times. They wait, we're having a board meeting, then we're going to decide, and everything changes because the board changes. So it is a good idea for a lot of reasons. Part of what David said about having an expert in your corner that said, look, we did our due diligence and we had somebody on board. And, if something goes wrong, which hopefully it doesn't, you're going to have someone you can lean on and say, look, what are the solutions to this problem? And usually we'll come up with those right solutions for them.
That's great. David, anything on your end, Haber?
For me, that's a really great question, and I don't have a simple answer. I don't have a litmus test that says if it's $250,000, get a project manager, owner's rep, or don't. But if it's, $700,000, do. But I can tell you there are three things that I believe. One, create your team. Two, get a bond. Don't do this project without a bond ever. And three, my threshold is probably $500,000 to somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million. You better get a project manager.
I'd say we're in the
owner's rep.
too. Anything under $1 million is kind of tough to justify. It depends on the project. We were called recently to look at a re-roof on a single building, and it turned out that it was just not going to make sense. I actually recommended that they get a roofing consultant because really they'd already had their bids and there wasn't much I could do. So there's certain things where it kind of makes sense, and we'll advise. I'm not afraid to say, look, this is probably not right for us, but here's a recommendation for you as how I might proceed. And we'll also offer them some information. I mean, we're an available resource for folks to call on and see what makes sense and doesn't. And all it is a phone call or a Zoom or a quick visit to determine if it makes sense or not.
There's another question in the chat. Are providers such as contractors, attorney firms, etc., liable if their advice or recommendations are wrong and cause damages to the association? Here's my answer. Contractors carry insurance. They also, if you have them bonded, have payment and or performance bonds. You can go against those should they fail to comply with their obligations under their contracts. Attorneys are kept to a standard in the community. If an attorney, in my opinion, doesn't recommend getting a bond, I think that's a mistake. I've seen many cases where they recommend the bond and the board ignores them. It's very hard to figure out what the attorney provided the advice if you're 3 or 5 years later trying to look back at what that advice was. But I can tell you, if you have a 2-page contract rather than a sophisticated contract, I don't think that's the proper standard in the community for an attorney. And most attorneys who are qualified and competent in construction and or condo law would never do that. So ultimately, if they don't meet the standard of care in the community, there is recourse. And of course, there's recourse against the engineers for bad design. And there's recourse against the owner's rep if they sign off on pay applications, giving money to the contractor when the contractor wasn't entitled to that money under the contract, or they hadn't completed that substantial amount of work that they're certifying that they agreed that they had completed.
It's a good point, David. We recently joined a project. It was late. It was the property manager had recently come on. We were brought on the project. They had signed a deal with the contractor. We got there day one. They had not started yet, and they received a 30+% deposit on the project. So I'm upside down day one. That just wouldn't have happened under our microscope. It just doesn't work that way. So now we don't really have the kind of leverage that we need to try and help push things along. We're doing what we got to do. We haven't really had any major issues, but when there is one, I don't have that money leverage. I don't have that hammer. And so that's important. And going back to the bond issue, one of the things that's really important for us, and we talked about qualifying contractors for your projects if you choose to do it on your own. The bond rate is very important because that's an indicator of the risk that lies with that contractor. And a great bond rate's about 1 point. The average might be 1.5. If you see somebody trending up past that or in the twos, it's kind of scratch your head time. The other thing is, and that's for a general contractor, your sub bonds will be more. And what typically might happen is, and a lot of these folks self-perform, but if they're bonding the job, their bonding age, normally don't force them to bond any sub trades they have on a job. So it's a little bit of a double whammy, but a lot of the trades, a lot of the industry works that way. So for instance, you've got a general contractor on the job or your restoration contractor, and he hires someone that's doing a significant painting project, and it's $500,000. They'll need to bond that sub as well. That's usually the direction of their bonding company. The other thing we work on and look at is the general liability insurance, which is the GL. And we want to see what they're carrying. That's very important as well. And their rate, because they'll typically share their rate if they're transparent enough. And again, that's important as well as the rate. The higher the rate, the more risk there is. And it's something you got to scratch your head about and say, why is that rate high? I've had claims. So there's this qualitative analysis as much as quantitative when you're selecting your team. And that's a big part of it that someone should bring to the table and help advise you accordingly.
It's great. David, shop, when you bid a contract and you start working on the project, what kind of increases do you see afterwards? Should you budget a certain percentage? There's a question here.
That's a tough
one of the
one.
biggest surprises. I know we were talking about doing destructive,
Yeah.
doing the big MRI and the X-ray, right? But
Yeah.
what are you seeing out there? What are the things that you're seeing out there when you go and look into these buildings that are 25 years and older?
Sure. So if you're talking about a structural restoration projects, kind of parlaying on what David had said earlier, it's tough to assign a number to what I think the problems might be. It comes down to how good is the engineer's report? How thorough was it? We're looking at a project now where the engineer went to every single balcony and sounded every single tile. That's great. It wasn't like 10 balconies and do some type of an analysis and extrapolation to say, well, this happened here, the rest of the building should be that. So the goal is to try and spend as much as you can on the preliminary analysis, whether by the engineer or destructive testing, to get your arms around what a scope might be. If you've done that, the contingency, let's call it, which is typically an owner contingency, could be somewhat finite. I've seen 20, 25%. That's a problem because if you haven't done that, like David said, you have a $4 million project, go to a $16 million project real quick. So, because you just don't know what's lying beneath those walls or beneath those terraces. So it's a difficult answer, and it's different. It varies by building. If we're doing an interior renovation or we're doing fire alarm or elevators, it's more finite. We can figure out and know where our risks lie. the risks on an exterior skin, specifically on the beach, it's a little harder to kind of come to terms with what that number is. And I know I'm kind of skating a little bit that issue, but it's hard to put a number to it. It's project specific. David, you want to bail me out here a little bit? Do you
What-
agree?
I think it's project specific. I agree with that. Um,
It's a
It's
tough one.
hard. It's hard because you don't know
It
what you're
really
buying.
is, but nobody's putting in 50% because they're not going to get, the board's not going to get the residents to agree to a 50% contingency on a project. So the
no,
real,
but that's why, things like, let me add this to you. You can look at balcony railings for peeling paint. You can look at balcony railings for, deterioration of the area around the post pocket by going out there. It's much harder to deal with the concrete underneath. It's much harder to deal with the stucco on the outside of the building because there you have to swing the building to look at it. And those are the ones where you have the need for the destructive testing. If you're looking at, glass panels on a balcony or balcony railings, you can see that. If you're looking at the garage and the expansion joints, you can get the linear feet of how many feet of expansion joint you have. But certain of the things you just have to do destructive testing. There's no way around it.
And one thing that we can do, and this is not unusual, is like David's heading in that direction, is you break the project down into components and you assign a risk factor to each. And one might be 10, one might be 20. We say, look, this particular thing we might want to figure a little bit higher because we know we have eminent risk there. And so you kind of work your way through it and see one of the questions is contingency mandatory. Nothing's mandatory, but it's highly advisable. And if we advise you to put a contingency in, and as a board member you don't, then that's what puts you at risk because you didn't listen to your
I
advice.
would never do it without a contingency.
Have to.
And I would never, and if I could use X-ray technology, infrared, maybe David, you could talk about infrared for corrosion or on a pool, the interior of a pool, whether you can, I mean, does that stuff work? And can it help you with a balcony? Can it help you with a pool where there may be corrosion in the walls, in the concrete?
It's been done, but there's no better way to do it than opening it up. And it's just the nature of the beast. You have to see it because you're just making assumptions. And there was a project that we looked at over in Aventura, and they didn't think that they were going to have problems with their terraces. And it turned out this is a very, very large project. And it was a huge change order. The contractor said, look, we're going to take all the terrace tile back now because they did a few and they realized that the rebar is creeping back to the units. And so now you've got a contractor on board, and now you're just faced with change orders, and it's just a chain. You can't really solve that problem, but you could have done some initial forensics to try and help figure out what that problem is. And going to terraces, some of the problems that a lot of these buildings have on these balconies is that they've trapped the moisture with these tiles. So a lot of these buildings weren't designed to have tile. Loading wise, not so bad, but it's more designed that this tile is going to go on there and trap moisture. Moisture gets in, it can't get out, so it corrodes. And a lot of these didn't have waterproofing below the tile, and it finds its way into the concrete. And now they got to come rip all the tile off, chip away, put the concrete back, cover up all, dress the rebar, put it back, waterproof it, tile it. We're doing a building in Fort Lauderdale where we decided that we're not going to put tile back. It was not the right approach because, again, the same problem's going to exist 10 years down the road in this particular case. And so we chose to just do a decking on there and not do tile. Many of these high-end buildings want to put the tile back. So we typically recommend at least a 10-year underlayment. In one building, we're doing a 20.
Well, one of the things that we recommend is that you have an engineer provide a specification
100%.
for the waterproofing on any balcony deck because it has to integrate with the sliding glass door. It has to integrate with the balcony edge and the balcony railing system. And if you don't have it proper, then the contractor is going to come in for your tile and they're going to mess it up. And they're going to have water just laying on there for year after year after year. And that's partially caused because you don't have a waterproofing spec. Let me try to go to a couple other questions here.
Sure.
One is it a mistake to add a high contingency because the bidding contractor will ask what the budget is? and which includes the contingency, and that will be the basis for starting to calculate his bid. The way it works is they put in the bid and then they add a line for contingency. David, answer this question.
So I don't see that question on mine here, but
Who puts in the contingency factor? Is it you or is it the contractor?
no, we do. We don't ask the contractor to put a contingency in the project. The owner carries a contingency. Sometimes they
But
want to
who is the
carry.
one who puts the percentage number? Is that the engineer? Is it the owner's rep? Or is it the contractor?
It's from the owner's contingency. It's a collaborative effort. Again, kind of like I said before, we need to understand the overall project, the components of the project, and where we might have to weight this contingency, and becomes a recommendation of the owner's rep and the engineer as to what we think it should be based upon the information we have.
Okay.
The
Next
board
question.
then has to make that decision. Do they want 25% or do they want to back it down to 20? So sometimes that we present, but we're not in a position to make that final approval. And it comes down to a special.
Next question. Which advice you give as a manager where you're in a 558 phase to effectively balance cost, time, and quality while ensuring that all stakeholders remain aligned with project goals, legal obligations, and daily operations? That's an easy one. Haber Law. Hire Haber Law will help you with your 558. But here's the thing. A 558 process requires buy-in from everybody. You have to have the right lawyers. You have to have the right engineers. You have to communicate with ownership as to when you need to inspect their units. You have to talk about destructive testing. You have to talk about pre-trial phases. You have to talk about budgeting for the 558. Are you doing it on a partial contingency, a full contingency, or on an hourly? How are you dealing with that? How are you raising the money? Are you doing it through money that you have set aside? Are you doing it through a special assessment? Are you doing it through a loan? All of these things work together in order to process the 558. And one of the ways to keep people aligned is to properly communicate. Have your engineer who's your expert witness come to a meeting with the owners. We always do slide presentation, PowerPoint presentations showing the conditions, the major ones, showing what's wrong, showing what needs to be fixed, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. Also, we give them a budget on the legal fees as best we can. We amend the budget as we go. Again, communicating with the owners, what's going on in the process, where we are in the process. Communication, effective communication is the key.
And then in execution, so now you've been through that process. Now it becomes a project, right? So now this has to get implemented. It's got to get bid. It turns into just what we've been talking about before, where we have to align ourselves with the right contractors in town and get your project manager on board and start towards execution. And that should happen long before the 558 claim is settled, because you want to be in a position to move this along. And so, David, I don't know if there's room in those 558 claims to say, okay, you need to actually allow for project management to be able to set this thing up so it doesn't fail. And I don't know if that becomes part of that claim or not, but separate to that.
There's another question. Does your company consult and manage such projects as ponds that the bank needs updated for county codes? I presume that's for you, David Shop.
Ponds. So they may be talking about such places as
Retention
ponds.
ponds.
So there are, you're probably talking about surface water management, and typically, any body of water here in South Florida requires that you recertify every 5 years, whether Broward County or Dade County. There's ERP in Broward, Durham, and Dade County. And so there's a process you have to go through. Typically, you hire a civil engineer to do that. It's not something that we would typically do, but an engineer, we're doing one now, and we brought the engineer in for the client. So it's usually not a very expensive type of thing to do, unless it's a lined pond that you're looking at doing something where you have to modify it. So it's tough to say exactly where that question's coming from, but hopefully I answered it. But it's a recertification, and it's pretty much, it's part of the South Florida Water Management District, and it gets delegated to the agencies.
All right. Next question was, how would you communicate to the community that after completing several major projects such as ELSS, electrical upgrades, you will now allocate SERS funding toward newly replaced components. If I understand that correctly, once you do a project, you now have a different time frame to redo it a second time. It could be 20 years, it could
Right.
be 15 years. So once you do the project, you may reassess your SIRS study. You may reassess your study to determine what is the new life expectancy of the new equipment in order to update your reserve study.
That's exactly right. Yes. So you need to plan. As soon as it's done, you got to plan it all over again and allow for that
Yeah,
life.
one of the things that I find really frustrating is and this used to happen, it's happening less. Boards would get a reserve study every 5 years.
Mhm.
And the people wouldn't even come out to the building to look. It was a joke. And now you can't do that. Now you got to get them I would get them every year or 2 years at the most.
Agreed. David Schott, there's a question here for you regarding some of these buildings that are 30 plus years old. How are you handling the cast iron situation? A lot of these buildings have cast iron, and they've been patching them for years. And
You talking about the piping?
the piping, yeah,
Yeah,
all that
we're
plumbing.
having it. We're working on a project right now where unless it's somewhat destructive testing, which is sad. We're working on a building that's 30 years old in Miami Beach, and we're replacing every bit of cast iron that's underground on that building to PVC, and it's a painful process because it's tidal. But it needed to get done, and it's one of those things where if you've got a building 30 years old, I guarantee you that your pipe that's under grade is leaking, and those pipes are disintegrating, and you need to go in there and do it. And it's not just a plumbing job, it's a structural job because most of those slabs are structural in nature. They need to be x-rayed, they need to be understood where the rebar goes, where the foundations live, and it becomes a little bit of Swiss cheese, but the work does need to get done. And we're actively in a project as we speak like that now. So it's paramount to review it. You know, the overhead cast iron, not so bad, but once it's under grade, all that salt water, that tidal water, whether you're coastal, which a lot of folks are, be prepared for a large project, unfortunately.
Are you seeing a big, another question came in is, are you seeing within, 20, 30 years, a lot of change in material, technology, the science, where a lot of this material is much stronger, better, will last longer? And does that actually help with the reserves? Because now a material that back in the days will last 15, 20 years can last 30 years. Are you seeing any of that? Either David Haber or
I mean,
Shop?
I can tell you on roofing and waterproofing and expansion joints, you're getting 20-year warranties because it's so expensive to change this stuff out, and getting the better quality materials is essential. And I could tell you that 20 and 30 years ago, people were giving 5-year warranties on waterproofing, and it was degrading by year 10, and you're ripping up the pool deck again, which nobody did, of course. And so what you had was from years 10 to 20 or 10 to 25, you had the garages and the pool decks leaking like a sieve, which is what causes the corrosion in the column. So, if you don't spend the money today, you're going to spend it and exponentially more later. But
and
yes, the materials are better.
And that becomes one of the largest problems we have is when we assemble the budget, which is not just the cost of waterproofing, but the permit fees, the soft costs, the logistics, all the things that actually play out, added security that we need to add to the project, all these things that to manage this project, including these extended warranties and certain things on projects. The client wants to know, where can I save? Well, that's really not, if you're in this building, it's the last place you want to save is trying to reduce a warranty because you're going to be back at it again. So it's self-serving to actually get that better warranty because at the end of the day, you're going to spend less down the road. So like David was saying, I concur. And somebody had asked a question, or do I have an engineer to recommend for ponds in Naples? I can't really give you a name here, but if you have my information, you can email me and I'll find someone over there for you.
David Shop, there's a question. If a building has a historical significance, uh, what restrictions are you following? How are you working with this when there's a historical significance to a certain building? I thought there was a law that changed that if it, right?
You know, You got me a little bit stumped there. You know, we've worked on a number of historical buildings, and you're required to actually bring these buildings up to par, and get them waterproofed and get them structurally sound. But there's certain things you have to go through this permitting process with the agency, whether it's City of Miami or Miami Beach.
Miami
And
Beach, you have to go to design review board a lot of times and get them to
Mhm.
sign off on any historic building, even for construction projects.
Coral Gables as well. A lot of these folks have their separate districts, separate. And we do it on a lot of our commercial projects where you just go through this historic building and we're modifying it. You just have to go through that. A lot of churches who've done that way, and it's not insurmountable. I mean, the agencies know that you
You
need
have to
to.
prepare that it's going to take extra time.
Yes, and it's going to cost more on a historic building. Unfortunately, it just will.
Right.
That
Yeah, we're down to the last 4 minutes here, gentlemen. All right, another question came in here. Are you still testing for asbestos and lead paint and all those things that they used to test for back 15, 20 years ago? Are you still finding a lot of that out there in the market?
I found it in old buildings where asbestos was an issue. I don't remember whether lead paint was an issue, but I've seen buildings where we've had to deal with mold remediation and asbestos remediation, but they're
Yeah.
typically older buildings, and it's typically something they're not expecting to find, but then they open stuff up and find it.
So for the most part, in Dade County, no matter what you do as far as a renovation to an interior, you're required to provide a asbestos survey. It's just the rules they have. But any building that's 20, 30 years old, likely not. If you go beyond that, you're going to find it. And it was usually in the flooring. They call it VAT. They call it VCT now, but it was vinyl asbestos tile. So, and in the ductwork is where you found it too in mastic. So we did a large renovation in Miami Beach, probably in the year 2000. I had $1 million asbestos remediation project because all the ductwork had to be remediated.
I can tell you, every school I went to in Dade County in the 70s and 60s probably had asbestos in it.
And look what's happened.
And look at me now, I have no hair.
So, but it does exist. It's out there. But again, if you're doing exterior skin, it's somewhat of a non-issue. Lead paint, just not seeing it a whole lot. Like you said, David, I haven't seen it in the reports as of late.
And I think we're going to do the final last question here. We know that in South Florida we don't use much of the heat, but when you're updating the HVAC and doing project management, are you seeing more gas heating or are you seeing more electrical element type of heating in these buildings?
As far as heating, you're talking
Just
about like
heating,
water heaters?
You're
water
talking
water
about
heaters,
water heaters,
HVAC.
or you're talking about pool heaters, or you're talking about HVAC heating?
They weren't specific, but maybe we can. Yep. For
Look, if you're
HVAC,
heating a pool, no,
No, they're
electric.
talking about HVAC.
they're talking about HVAC.
Yeah, a lot. If it's a building that's got a cooling tower system, it's likely going to be reverse cycle, and it's going to be part of that system. Electric heat strips, you'll find them sometimes in your fan coil units in your buildings. It really depends on the building and what's in their system, but
It
heat,
depends also how old the building is.
yeah, it has a lot to do with that. But it varies by building. That's kind of a loaded question. It's going to
And
vary.
by the way, that's where the MEP engineer comes in to set the specs and determine what you need. One thing I'm going to tell you is do not have the rooster in the hen house. Do not have the contractor be the one to tell you what you need. The contractor is the one who's going to execute based on what the engineer or architect specify. Do not have the contractor tell you what you need. That is just an essential component of understanding what we're talking about here today. If you take
100%.
nothing else from this seminar, take that.
And let me add to that to say that sometimes just calling out an engineer for a mechanical system might be great, but you may have fire alarm issues, you may have roofing issues, you may have the parking garage issues. It's much broader and bigger than just one topic. So trying to, if there's board members on here and board presidents, the best thing you can do is have your advocate and assemble the information so you're more educated, so that when you go and talk about special assessments and next steps, you have your arms around the projects, not just a project, because it's usually much more than that.
Yep. So I think the message here is hire professional, licensed, insured.
Especially to protect you as a board member for your professional protection as business judgment rule, rely on your professionals. It costs money, but it saves and protects you in the end. And since there are now potential liabilities for board members and CAM managers, you want to rely on your experts, your management company, your lawyer, your engineer or architect, your owner's rep. Rely upon them to protect you.
Great. All right. It's 3 o'clock, gentlemen. It was truly a pleasure having the
Thank you for
discussion
having
with
me.
you. Everyone look forward to our next webinar next month. On behalf of David Haber from Haber Law, David Shop from Sharp Project Development, and Alex Martin from KW, thank you for attending. Have a great
Thank you
day.
all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good day.